Let's get together. Somebody ring the bell. Our, our, our cowbell is becoming very famous in the world of YouTube. Our cowbell is definitely becoming famous now. We have that distinctive cowbell. Nobody has that, you know. Just ask them. There's lots of people streaming right now. Nobody has the cowbell. We're special. We need that. More cowbell. That's from the movie, right? Okay. Yes. Okay. That's good. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's study for a little while. I've been discussing the topic of purity customs in food and washing hands and all kinds of things like that, and taking you into even the territory of the fences around Torah. We've talked a little bit about that for a while, and there's a reason why that's important, because actually it's kind of an underlining part of everything that has to do with food laws and purity laws in Judaism. If you don't understand the concept of fences and how it works and why it works and how it functions, then it makes no sense, essentially. People just say, oh, you just have a bunch of rules. Well, no, those rules are that way for a reason, and they came about in a very specific way. And that's what we've been doing. We've been looking at the purity customs because after Pesach, I just realized how much people don't understand purity customs. And so much in Passover has to do with purity. Like, we wash our hands, we wear kittel, like all these things that on Passover, they're like special things that we do. They all have to do with purity. Even like removing the chametz from our houses, like all of that. These are all teachings and actions that we perform that have to do with the laws of purity. Many of those Levitical laws that we find in the Torah that people just kind of try to read over really, really fast and not fall asleep. So let's talk about it some more. I have some more ideas for you. As I said this before, and this is me just repeating it a little bit, many Jewish traditions, customs, and observances, including purity customs and food laws, they're fences. That's what they're designed. They model a way of life, and they inculcate a proactive disposition towards obedience. That's what they're doing. That's what fence is about. Fence is designed to help you. You can look at the fence in a negative way. You can look at the fence in a positive way. So these fences create barriers that keep people at a distance from sin and transgression. They keep us in a good place, right? Where a lot of times when people talk about fences in a bad sense is they keep you away from the good things, right? Please understand that these fences are not set up to keep you away from the good things. They keep you away from the bad things, from sin, from transgression, from living the way that, the rest of the world lives and really don't care about. So that's really what fences are about. So here's a temple, and here's a big fence around the temple. Do you notice that? A big fence. The whole entire plaza of the temple is set up with a fence. And look at outside. Jerusalem also has a fence all around it. It's a fenced city. There's a reason why there are fences in the city. So I'm going to begin our discussion today is really about Pesach. We kind of started on that way, and so I want to continue this theme going. Since antiquity, Passover has been a communal experience, and hopefully you understand that. It's all about celebrating together with other people. And at the center of the holiday is eating Korban Pesach, the Passover lamb. That's really what it was all about. It's a holy offering that was sacrificed in the temple courts. So people would come to Jerusalem, they would get a place, stay somewhere, hopefully within the city, because they would need to eat their Passover lamb in the city. Why? Because Passover lamb is actually holy, special. Okay, it's a korban, it's a sacrifice. And they would eat it within the walls. And there's some interesting commandments in the Torah, by the way. Someone once came to me and says, look, it says in the Torah that, the uncircumcised shall not eat Passover. How come you have all these people at your Passover Seder that don't belong? And I had to remind to them that we don't actually eat Passover lamb at Passover Seders today. The prohibition of eating Pesach is the Passover lamb. And the prohibition is about eating it. It's not about having a Seder. okay, or eating matzah, or drinking wine. That's not what's really holy in Passover. What's really, truly holy is the korban, the actual sacrifice. And people who did not come out of Egypt, who did not experience these things, suppose the idea is that if that's not who they are, then why should they be, sort of say, remembering that act? Because it's a redemption of a community. That's why I said it's a communal type practice. So please understand that, having seders, if ever anybody tries to spring that verse on you, now you know how to answer. Having seders is not the same thing as eating a Passover sacrifice. Exactly. So the Passover was all about sharing the meat of the lamb. That's how people celebrated it. And what took the place of that offering in our times, in our day, because we have no lamb, is the afikomen. So you're familiar with the afikomen. You know what it means. Strange, word spelled out in Hebrew, but really is Greek. And so what I want you to realize is that the actual positioning of the afikomen in this place, in this kind of a way, is a modern fence to remember the holiness of sacrifices. Why do we practice the eating of afikomen in that way? Why do we have these rules and laws about something that actually wasn't a part of the original Passover ritual? I mean, do you think Moses had afikomen? No, of course he didn't have afikomen. He had the real thing. He had the Passover lamb. But we don't have the Passover lamb, so what do we have? We have afikomen. So why do we have it? The point is to keep the memory of the lamb alive. Because if we treat afikomen as if it was the Passover offering, then when we actually regain back that chance of having a Passover offering, we haven't lost that propriety, that sanctity, that we haven't lost the core of what Pesach is about, because it's all about the Passover lamb. So symbolically, traditionally, afikomen has become a stand-in for the lamb. And I want you to realize that's what it is. It's a stand-in. It's like the lead cast member of the play got sick. So you call somebody else to stand in for him because the show must go on. Because you can't just cancel the entire Broadway production, right? So imagine this. We lost the ability to have the Pesach lamb. So the afikomen comes in and stands in for the Passover lamb. And that's why it's treated with the same rules and sanctity and the same type of a kind of a holy way. Yes, ma'am?
I think of the shank bone stand-in.
It's there. It's another stand-in. Except we don't gnaw on the shank bone, right? We don't actually eat it. But the afikomen we eat, right? See, that's the idea. The shank bone is there for the lamb to remind us. It's to show us, that connection to the lamb. But the afikomen is something tangible that we can actually eat. And that's important. That's why it's a stand-in. So I wanted to share this passage for you. This is from Ketzur Shulchan Aruch 119. It's a 16th century document. Shulchan Aruch was put together by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was a Sephardic rabbi. But even Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews follow Shulchan Aruch. So he has made this sort of say a universally accepted Jewish teaching in the 16th century. And people still follow it. It's still important. We have it on the shelf. It's the foundation of the halacha. So this is what's in the shorter abbreviated version of Shulchan Aruch. It says, after completing the meal, these are the laws of the Passover, the afikomen is eaten to remind us of the Pesach sacrifice. So look at that. It says, Zecher lekorban Pesach. It literally tells you, for the memory. That's what it is. It's the memory of the korban Pesach, which was eaten at the end of the meal, so that you should be completely satiated, meaning you're supposed to be full. You're satisfied. And then the korban Pesach comes out. It is proper to eat 2 zaitim. It literally means 2 olive size pieces of matzah of the afikomen. One to remind us of the Pesach sacrifice, and the other to recall the matzah that was eaten with the korban Pesach. So remember, people ate. It says in the Torah, you shall eat the Passover sacrifice with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. So that's what Rabbi Yosef Karo is writing about. So at any rate, you should not eat less than a zait, an olive. And you should eat the afikomen while reclining. Now, why would you do this to a piece of matzah? Again, because of what it represents. It stands in for the Pesach offering. If you eat the afikomen reclining, then when we get back the Korban Pesach, you'll remember, oh, I don't need the afikomen anymore. And you already know how to eat Korban Pesach because you didn't lose that tradition. It says after eating afikomen, it's forbidden to eat anything. See, we do treat it exactly like Korban Pesach today. The third cup is then filled for Rikat Hamazon. So that's the tradition, that's the custom, that's the order of the Seder. You don't eat anything after afikomen. Why do we treat this matzah different than all the other matzah? Because of what it represents. So I want you to realize this tradition is a fence. You know it's a tradition. You know it's a custom we follow. But it's designed to protect us and to keep us grounded in holiness so that we do not forget the important things. Because sometimes we do. Things that fall in disuse, things that are not practiced, are initially forgotten, dismissed, and no longer important. So we do believe that we will come back to this practice of eating Pesach again. So guests that we had a lot of guests who participated in our communal Passover Seder. They were invited to wash their hands after we had already drunk from the first cup. You know, that was seems like a strange custom for many people. And it was an awkward timing. So why not wash our hands before we took our seats? You remember, we sat down, we started getting into the service, and then I'm like, okay, now we get up and wash our hands. Well, that seems like a logistically bad timing to decide to wash your hands. Why couldn't we do that before? Again, if it's just pragmatic of washing our hands, I could have passed a bunch of bottles of Purell around and made everybody stay seated, right? But that's not what it was about. It meant something. And at that point in the service, it meant something. So why did it happen the way it happened? And so, by the way, you see the wash cup right there, you see the fist. And so people don't quite connect. Like a lot of guests, they really didn't know. It was for their first time experiencing something like that. Well, maybe I can give you a little bit of an explanation. This is another passage that I wanted to read, and I have actually several slides of this one. This is from Mishnah, from Tractate Kelim, from chapter 1. Mishnah is a 2nd century CE document. And it explains to us, this particular passage explains to us something about holiness. Holiness and purity are tied, as you can understand. It's all right there all over Leviticus that we've been studying. They're inextricably tied together. So this passage talks about different degrees or grades of holiness. So this is what the rabbis are writing. There are 10 grades of holiness. The land of Israel is holier than all the other lands. Does that make sense? It's different, right? It's God's. And God said a lot of things about the land of Israel He didn't say about other countries. And then what is the nature of its holiness? They ask the question. That from it are brought the omer and the first fruits and the 2 loaves which cannot be brought from any other lands. So you see the omer, it has to come from Israel. You cannot take a sheaf from Syria and bring it in the temple. That won't count. It has to be from that land. That's what makes that land holy, because this is God blessing that land, God making that grain grow. So the omer comes from that. The 2 loaves of the Shavuot comes from that. That's the idea. The first fruits, the bikurim, they come from that because God promised all these things, so He fulfilled His promises. That's what makes it holy. The land of Israel is different. God did not make promises like that to everybody else, but to this land He did. So then the rabbis continue. Cities that are walled are holier. So if you're in a city that actually has walls, it has a different degree of sanctity or holiness. So they explain, for Mitzoras must be sent out of them, and the corpse, though it may be carried about within them as long as it is desired, may not be brought back once it has been taken out. So cities that are walled have certain purity because somebody who has tzara'at is not allowed to be in the city. They have to live outside the walls. So automatically, that means everybody in those walls has a different status of purity already. And dead bodies, again, you don't bury a person inside the walls of the city. You bury them outside the walls of the city. So that means now everything inside that walled city is a little bit holier than things outside of those walls. Let's see. Let's continue reading. the area within the wall of Jerusalem, so now we're moving to Jerusalem, not just any city, is holier. For it is there that the lesser holy things and second tithe may be eaten. So you eat the Passover offering within the walls of Jerusalem. You try to stay within the city. And so some sacrifices would be eaten inside the city of Jerusalem. You can leave the temple, but you don't leave the city. Then the rabbis continue on. The Temple Mount is holier. So again, the Temple Mount is holier than the actual walled city of Jerusalem. So you just keep getting holier and holier. For Zavim, Zavot, menstruants, women after childbirth may not enter it. So yeah, Temple Mount has a certain level of holiness. The Chel is holier, for neither non-Jews nor anyone who contracted corpse impurity may enter it. So of course now we're talking about the outer court. Okay? That's also holier. The holiness keeps increasing. It says the court of women is holier, for a tivul yom, that means an immersion, a daily immersion. A person who's immersed may not enter it, though he's not obligated a chatat for doing so. So now rabbis are getting into technical reasons why. Maybe if it doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. The principle still works. They're on the right track. They keep explaining the holiness. The court of the Israelites is holier, for a man who has not yet offered his obligatory sacrifices may not enter it, and if he enters it, he is liable for chatat. Meaning everyone who is in the side of the court of the Israelites would have already brought his obligatory offering. So again, the holiness just keeps increasing. The only people that are going to be surrounded by in that court are all the people who are in a certain state of purity. All the other things that prohibited have already been sifted out, eliminated, and all these people have already brought an obligatory sacrifice. That means they're in a certain state with Hashem. And so you're right there standing with them. So chatat is sin offering, by the way. Sorry, I have a lot of Hebrew words scattered around here. So the court of the priests is holier. For Israelites may not enter it except when they are required to do so, for laying on of the hands and slaying or waving. So the court of the priest, that front area in front of the altar, the regular Israelite did not get to go there unless they were specifically invited because there was a ritual that they were involved. You had to lay your hands on an animal to confess the sins, to transfer these things. And so there's certain gifts that were brought to God. They were waved before the altar, before they were placed on the altar and were burnt. And that in that situation, an Israelite would be invited temporarily to step into the court of the priest to do that, and then they go back to the court of Israelites. So that means that place is even holier because you just kind of step in and step out, and you're back in there. And every layer is just, sort of say, has its own gradation of holiness, its own level. So the rabbis continue in Mishnah. It says the area between the porch, Ulam, and the altar is holier. For priests who have blemishes or unkept hair may not enter it. So we just read about it today, right? Unkept hair. This is what we're talking about. It's that idea of something being wrong with your hair. Your hair is wild and crazy, and like that's what we're reading about. So they're not supposed to come there. And blemish is another thing. So just past the first reading, it talks about any priest that has any kind of a defect. He cannot come and offer offerings. Now, he can serve God, he just cannot bring offerings. And so that area is off limits to them. So only certain priests go into that place. It says the Heichal. This is now inside the building. Okay? We're off the porch now. The Heichal is holier. For no one whose hands or feet are unwashed may enter it. You cannot go into the building of the temple, actually, from the court into the building, unless your hands and your feet were washed. You have to go through that ritual cleansing, that laver, right? So again, only the priests would do that, but even they are not allowed to enter unless they washed. And it says the Holy of Holies is holier, for only the high priest on Yom Kippur at the time of service may enter it. So you see, so now we got the last holy place right there, the very inner sanctum. This is the 10 degrees of holiness that the rabbis saw. Now, hopefully it makes sense to you why you would want to build fences between each area to communicate to people that you are crossing from one to the other, to the other, to the other. And there are rules for each, as you have heard. There are certain commandments, there are certain regulations for coming closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to the creator of the universe, to his very presence. Temple is a complicated but a very majestic place. And if you understand its structure and its intent, it is designed in a very specific way. So again, what does it all teach us? It teaches us this gradation of holiness, and hopefully you understand that the purity customs that exist, many of them are tied to these very fences, to these divisions and separations that people recognize in a life. The closer you get to Hashem, the more purity matters, or the type of a purity actually matters. So I wanted to show you that, because in this way of thinking, if this is how you think, everything exists in various degrees of holiness. And the appropriate level of purity is required to be in each one of those places. You can't just walk in and stroll all the way into the Holy of Holies. I mean, I realize there may be some songs out there that are kind of suggesting that, where you just stroll right in. That's really not how it's like. Common practice of basically that exists in Judaism is, you know about this, bracha, the blessing. It turns ordinary things into holy. There's a reason why we say blessings. We recite prayers. We take something that's common and we turn it into holy by blessing God's name and by bringing God into this very process. So when we wash our hands, we say a blessing. All of a sudden, that changes it. It's not just me washing hands. It's me washing hands for a different reason. When we eat, we say a blessing. And all of a sudden, that food is not just food, it's a food that I eat with Hashem. Right? And it's holy, it's special, it's different. So we take ordinary things and we transform them. Then why do we do that? That's the fence. That's the tradition. We are trying to create for us a level of holiness that brings us closer to Hashem. We are essentially taking a step forward by elevating ourselves and everything we do in our environment. And that is a practice that has been around for a long time. It's a very, very ancient practice. We do this in 1,000 different ways with this practice of bracha, a blessing. That's why we say Baruch atah Adonai, and then the text alters, right? Drake, you had something?
Yeah, what's interesting, and one of the reasons I always kind of liked the Pharisees in your philosophy was the fact that, like the Sadducees, for example, they kind of thought the temple was their abode, and just bring us your offerings, and we'll take care of things, and what have you. And so, but the Pharisees seemed to kind of democratize things a bit.
Yes.
We're going to take the sanctity of the temple and we're going to kind of diffuse it among the people. So if you're a carpenter or a blacksmith, and maybe nobody of great importance with regard to the temple, you can still be likened to a priest when you approach your kitchen table.
That's right.
and do the baruch and wash your hands. And so I think sometimes, like when in Mark 7 or something like that, when people see the hand washing, they think, oh, this was some terrible thing that the Pharisees were pressing down upon the Jewish people to make Torah hard. And it's like, no, we were trying to take what was in the temple, like in Zechariah 14, it says that every vessel will be holy in Jerusalem, I think, at the end of days. So there's this sense where we're trying to diffuse the holiness out amongst the people.
Yes.
And not have it just kind of immured within the temple.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're right. The Pharisees did democratize holiness. And again, this is a theological idea. Think about it this way. If you want to experience closeness with God, you can experience closeness with God by elevating your eating experience at home. Now, your home does not turn into a temple, but you can treat it as if it was. And what does that do to you? It elevates you. It elevates your worshipfulness before Hashem, and it changes you in the end. Yeah. But you are doing this intentionally, and who gets praised? Who gets the glory? No, you're not trying to displace the temple, replace the temple, but you are trying to plug into that, and you create that at home, essentially. That was the revolutionary idea of their spirituality.
There is this other, I think, this tension that kind of exists with, like, when it comes to, after everything was kind of consolidated near the temple. Like in Exodus, for example, everybody, like all the princes of the tribes come forward and they offer their offerings at Mount Sinai because Aaron hadn't consolidated everything yet,
Right.
after the golden calf incident. And so it was thought that perhaps like the firstborn of every home, like you could have theoretically your own home altar.
Right.
And that's the way many of the nations did it. Like if you read
Yeah,
the
it was
Greeks.
designed that way originally.
Yeah, and so so there was. It seems like it was consolidated throughout Jewish history because of fears of idolatry, but there was this kind of tension where we want to take it out of the temple, but we can't because of the commandment.
Right.
But we can make little, I guess, simulacra of what it's like in the temple. That we make it slightly different in some ways, so it's not co-opting, but
It is a gesture of worship in the end. That's really all it is. It's just us trying to draw closer to God in a very tangible, real way. In the way that we can without necessarily breaking the commandments, but we're also imitating that temple purity. And that's exactly what happens. So the Pharisees, they elevated their ordinary meals to the level of temple purity, which is really important. What made Pharisees Pharisees is that they ate their meals, their everyday meals. They were not priests, but they treated those meals as if they were holy sacrifices brought in the temple. That was their choice. They didn't have to do that. They wanted to do that. Why? Because they felt closer to God. They felt that that presence was there because they took those steps towards God. I guess he would take a few steps towards them and he would fill their house with that kind of a holy presence. So that's why a lot of these purity customs actually exist. That's where they come from. They come from this antiquity. So before the standard halacha was established, learned Jews actually argued about the priorities of cleansing items. This is what I like to call the inside or the outside of the cup argument. What is more important? What's inside the cup that needs to be clean, or does the outside of the cup needs to be clean? You just kind of assume that what's inside the cup is fine. It's what's outside the cup because you're holding on to it with your hand, right? And your hand transfers impurity. So it can transfer impurity of the vessel, but then you drink out of that vessel, you're drinking what's on the inside. You're not drinking from the outside, right? Hopefully you're not licking the outside of the cup as you're drinking. That's the idea, right? So like you're sampling things from the inside. So this is the old argument. What is more important? Where do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the outside of the cup being clean because I'm holding this cup with my hand and I'm going to be eating with my hands, by the way, later on? Because guess what? There are no forks and knives. They don't exist. Knives exist, but and things like that. But people did not have individual servings like that. They tend to eat with their hands. So, or is it the outside or is it the inside? That's what I call that argument. And in that time in Judaism, there was still a lot of arguments about that. It wasn't settled. It was something that's still being worked out. We actually see this in the New Testament. So, in Matthew 23, these are famous verses. Not a great chapter because it criticizes Pharisees and it's been brought upon all Jews because all Jews are Pharisees, of course. That's how it's been interpreted. But put that aside. Yeshua is being very harsh on Pharisees. He criticizes them a lot here. So he says, you blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Now what is that about? It's a metaphor, right? You've missed the big things, but you focus on tiny little things which are not that important. Like here's the obvious elephant in the room and you kind of don't want to talk about it. You just focus on the tiny little insect. It says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You hypocrites. Like you ignore something so important, so big, you go for the little stuff. It says, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they're full of robbery and self-indulgence. Now, obviously, you see, we just got symbolic, right? He talked about you're very concerned about the purity of the outside of the vessel. That's important. So I just read to you from a tractate Kilim. By the way, much of the tractate of Kilim is dedicated to the purity of the vessels and how you're supposed to purify them. Many people know that there's a custom before Pesach. If you ever see Jews go out and immerse their vessels into a mikveh and boil them and do all kinds of stuff, that is another custom of purity. It is described in the tractate Kilim, by the way. And so here's this idea of cleaning the outside of the cup, cleaning the outside of the dish, because it's very important. But inside, he says, what you fill it with is full of robbery and self-indulgence. Now you realize we're not talking about any food substance, right? We're talking about how people live their life. So why would he say that Pharisees were participating in robbery and self-indulgence? Well, because many of them were very wealthy. and they were despised for their wealth, and they didn't care about spreading their wealth to the people. And so he says, look, you are getting rich off the people, and you are indulgent in how you live, but there's many people who are suffering. So he had some criticism. So we get the idea he's probably not talking about all Pharisees, but he's probably talking about some very specific ones he knows. He probably could mention names, but he decided not to. Okay, so this is a harsh criticism, so please take it in context. So he continues, says, you blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. So you can kind of understand now which side of the argument Yeshua might fall into, right? He believes that the inside is important. So again, he turns this into a symbolic teaching, saying that you got to get yourself right with God. Then, rather than concerned with the, oh, is this cup pure? Is this dish been properly immersed into a mikvah pool before I drink out of it, or eat out of it? Did it go through that? Well, wait a minute, did you go through that? Do you maybe need to go immerse yourself into a mikvah pool because there's something going on inside of you that's so defiling and terrible and awful, and who cares if that dish is okay? You are not okay. So again, this is that teaching. And so people had these debates about what's important. The inside, washing the outside of the cup, or what's inside the cup, is that more important? It's about straining the gnats, by the way, that goes back into the food idea, because gnats would get into cups, and if you swallow a gnat, you actually are eating an unkosher animal now. But it's a gnat. So anyway, that comes with the territory. They do make it into food and drink occasionally. So I want to make you aware that this is the kinds of things that were happening in the first century. And so we jump into these texts in the Gospels, and we don't fully understand the context. Why? Because we don't understand purity laws, and we don't understand all the fences. And we don't understand the fences that are still being put up. And some of those are mobile fences. They haven't become set fences yet. In the Gospels, we're experiencing a moment in culture where Judaism is still trying to figure out a lot of its laws. Later on, when you go into Mishnah, they are more or less set. There's still disagreements, but they're less. In the New Testament, it's still being formed. The decisions have not been rendered just yet. So we have this practice, netilat yadayim. We talked about it. It literally, netilat yadayim means taken up of your hands. That's really what it means. And sometimes you would see people wash their hands and they will do this. They will literally do this gesture because that's what it means. Sometimes the hands are just held upward as the blessing is recited, because that's what the custom is called. And so Jewish wash cups, again, they're easy to recognize. To handles, you handle each one by pouring over each hand. That's why there's two, because the idea of the cross-contamination, of course. So before food, you start with the left, then you move to the right. That's how it's done. And so there are some other uses, sort of say, that are done in a different order, but as far as washing before touching food, that's how that's done. So if you're familiar with that custom, you understand. But a lot of people, for example, that we had at our Passover celebration, definitely were not familiar with the custom, and they just didn't quite follow. Because I watched people try to wash their hands. They didn't really know what they were doing. But I didn't want to take up too much time giving people instructions, because I think the object lesson was more important than the instructions themselves at that point. So most translators, when they come to the New Testament, they actually lack insight in Jewish purity rituals, and they lack insight in Jewish particular and peculiar practices. So when they encounter a term for a closed fist, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 7, they often leave the Greek term completely untranslated. They just leave the word. They choose not to translate it at all. Why would you wash hands with a closed fist? It makes no sense to them. They come to that passage, it says you're supposed to wash your hands with a closed fist, and they say, this is nonsense, I can't put that in the Bible. So I'm just going to pretend that word is not there, and I'm not going to translate it.
They don't get it.
Seriously. Why? They don't understand why. It's like, it makes no sense, so I'm just going to pretend it's not there. And that happens, and it shows to us that people don't understand. So here's Revised Standard Version, a very respected translation, okay? So there you go. It says, now when the Pharisees gathered together to him, meaning Yeshua, with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands defiled, meaning impure. Okay? In Greek it says koinos, means common, not holy. that is unwashed. That's actually a pretty good translation. So Eideh says. And then there's a little bit of a parenthetical statement in verse 3. Of course, in Greek, there are no parentheses. It says, for the Pharisees and all the Jews, maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration, do not eat unless they wash their hands, and this is where the word for fist would be put in, observing the tradition of the elders. So RSV just pretends that the word for fist does not exist there at all. Because they don't know how to translate it. It just makes no sense. So we continue. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they purify themselves. And there are many other traditions which they observe. The washing of cups and pots, right below. This is what we've just been talking about. What's really important is the fact that the outside of the cup is clean. The washing of cups and pots and vessels of bronze. So that, and here the translator's parenthetical statement ends, and he goes back. Verse 5. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with hands defiled? So again, the whole passage, of course, is about tradition, right? And the disciples seem to be neglecting the tradition. And it's normal to ask the rabbi, why didn't you teach them? Rabbi, you didn't teach them well. Why are they living not like the rest of us? Why are they doing this? And of course, we don't know the true answer because he didn't tell them, but Yeshua launches into a kind of a very long answer there. It's complicated. But what I want you to see is this scenario of hand washing that exists in the first century. And this makes people upset and makes them uncomfortable. Why? Because there's this established custom of washing hands, established custom of washing hands before you eat food, and a very particular procedure. But what you don't see here is the idea of washing your hands with a closed fist. Why? Because it makes absolutely zero sense to the translators who don't really understand the culture. But they will make a lot of commentary on that passage. Abundant commentary. Pages and pages and pages of commentary in each and every verse, even though they actually do not understand even the very foundation and the gist of why it's being done that way.
I had the impression that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that the argument in this, in context, they were arguing in regards to when to wash hands, that it was either before or after, like there was like the school, like Shammai versus the school of...
That was one of the aspects. So it's when to wash hands. Remember I told you the timing? So today, the modern day halacha, okay, is that you first raise the cup, and after you touch the cup, you wash your hands, because you assume that the outside of the cup is not pure. Because what's inside the cup is not a problem. What's outside, because now you touched it. That's why after Kiddush, you go to the netilat yadayim, not before Kiddush. Because remember, you're going to handle the cup. So that's why it's done that way. Because after Kiddush is when you start actually tearing things with your hands and tasting. Whether if it's Kadesh, the first cup in Passover, then of course you go straight to the karpas, right? Things like that. So, and then if it's a regular Shabbat, then of course you go to challah right after that. So that makes sense that you would wash your hands after touching the cup, because you assume the outside of the cup is actually not clean. See, there is a specific logical order to why we do things. Yes, it is an inconvenient time. It would have been a lot easier to wash your hands and then just come to the table, right? But no, we get up from the table, wash our hands, then we come back. And it's like, it continues. So yes, right, Joshua, you're right. It is about timing. There's a lot more in this passage.
So they were actually washing hands. It was just not, it wasn't in regards to like, it wasn't about them not doing it. Because it says here that they were ignoring the
tradition. They were ignoring the tradition of the elders.
They were just doing it at a different time.
Right, and there were different traditions. What I want you to realize is that there is a bit of a difference between how Galilean Jews lived and how cosmopolitan Jerusalem Jews lived. So most of the people, if you notice, they came from Jerusalem. So these were Jerusalemites telling Galileans how they're country bumpkins and they don't really know how to live. They don't know how to do Jewish right, essentially. Again, this is all traditions. And among traditions, this is the time I want you to see. The halacha is not settled. People are still deciding when and how, before, after, during. A lot of these details are still being worked out. There's not unity on that among Jewish people. So yeah, you will see differences of how people follow traditions. But when you make that difference a problem, when you make that the bone of contention, such that's when it becomes an issue. And that's where Yeshua is going to say some very harsh words to them, right? He's going to criticize them for some of their traditions, by the way. That's kind of that answer. But what I want you to see here is the actual custom of washing hands. So this is something that's been going on in the first century. That's how far back it goes. And it's there. And people are going to try to spin this passage in a very negative way, saying that, oh, Yeshua, he's anti-washing hands. Come on. Think about it. So, unlike the regular washing, because we get dirty, we do need to wash, ritual washing is performed by pouring water over a closed fist. Yes, this is a very peculiar way of doing it, but there's a reason why. We do not open our hands because we are washing for a spiritual reason. It's our inside that needs to be purified, not only the palms and fingers. So that's what we're doing this is actually symbolism in closing your hand and pouring over your fist rather than pulling over an open hand. We're saying something by that very gesture, actually. But people don't know this because this is so cultural, this is so unique. This is such an insider information. So they come to the passages in the New Testament, they have no idea how to translate it because, of course, it's all in Greek and it makes it even more complicated. So, like most Jews of his day, Yeshua was really not against washing of hands or purity traditions. Come on, let's just be real. It's comical to see people interpret Mark 7 this way and completely miss the point. Yeah, Jesus hates you washing hands. Please stop washing hands. Like, what kind of a religious teaching is that? That's not it. Now, of course, Yeshua stressed that washing hands is a spiritual exercise, but the Pharisees focused primarily on external cleansing, where internal defilement, or what he calls evil thoughts, immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, and so on and so forth, all the things he mentions in verses 21 and 22, is much more serious. So he wanted to draw attention to that. They just wanted to make sure that the hands were washed at the right time in the right way. See, that's what the argument is really about. The priority of things. And that's why people cannot understand that passage and take it into wild places, like saying that Yeshua is against purity laws and purity traditions and we should not wash our hands. In fact, everything has been nullified and you can do whatever you want now, kind of thing. So kosher laws are canceled. I mean, I've read commentary upon commentary. They will actually draw that idea out of Mark 7 right there. So here's a few passages from different translations. I just want you to see how translators struggle trying to translate it. Okay, so this is KJV, first one. Everybody loves KJV, very respected translation. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding to the tradition of the elders. I know it's kind of weird and backwards because they actually follow the Greek word flow. So which is why if King James ever sounds wonky to you, it's because they're trying to imitate the flow of Greek. They're very literal in that sense. So they says they wash their hands oft. Oft, I assume, means often. Okay? So here's ASV, American Standard Version. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands diligently, eat not, holding tradition of the elders. So diligently is not the same thing as often, but like really hard, maybe like scrubbing it, like consistent. Thoroughly, like I'm gonna really put some work into it. Or regularly, so that could mean oft. That's a kind of a corresponding idea. They're making sure they're doing it. So I like that. So again, they're trying to translate. They're trying to work that through. So here's another one, ESV, English Standard Version. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. So here's the word properly. So they're still trying to get this. How did they wash their hands? Well, there's a proper way and there's an improper way. So if they don't wash their hands properly, they don't eat. Okay, I get it. They're still working on it. Young's literal translation. This is a good one. So it's an older translation, but actually it's nice. It says, for the Pharisees and all the Jews, if they do not wash their hands to the wrist, do not eat, holding tradition of the elders, to the wrist. So now we talk about washing our hands, like making sure that this is how far I gotta be clean. They're still trying to work it out. They're trying to figure out how this whole washing of hands needs to happen. Why? Because in the text is a word that they cannot translate, and they're struggling with it all the time. And this is every translation upon translation trying to get it right, and kind of missing it. So here's another one, NIV, okay, New International Version. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. So you see, they're getting closer. NIV actually, surprisingly, is getting it better than all of these other translations, or at least closest to what it means, right? They're not literal, and NIV is not claiming to be literal, but they're actually getting it pretty close.
Using the word properly, in my mind, is getting close. They just don't know what proper is. They
Right.
don't explain it. So, yeah.
But see how they're all trying, okay? Are you ready to see what the text actually says? Okay, because it's so simple. So this is what the Greek text actually says. Ean me, if not, pugme, which means with the fist. Okay? Nipsontai, they wash, tascheras, their hands. This is literal, word for word. I'm giving you word for word Rabbi Peter's translation. Okay? So, if not with the fist, they wash their hands. That's what the Greek actually says. There's nothing hard or confusing about the word pugme. All of the fancy translations that you saw, oft, properly, diligently, all of them are trying to reflect that word pugme, fist, which they do not understand. The word pugme is a common word. It just means fist, and it makes sense. But only for those people who actually know why. Because why would you wash your hands and close them? Because isn't the point to get them clean? This is where I'm trying to show to you that people miss the very idea of ritual purity. And that's why passages like that become incomprehensible, intranslatable, and later cause pages and pages of commentaries and conclusions built on those commentaries that lead you in places that are absolutely unbelievable. Like, we're talking about a different planet, unbelievable. How did you get there? How many leaps did you have to take to get there? So yeah, here it is, washing your hands with the fist. It really is that simple. But you could see how people struggle because they don't understand. So all I had to do was come around with Jews and ask a question, right? Yes. But this is a tragedy. The tragedy of the Christian community is they have separated themselves from the Jewish people. Maybe unintentionally, maybe intentionally, call it whatever you want, I do not know why, but the doors are not closed. They're open, and they know when we meet. And they can come in, and they can visit, and they can sit in, and they can talk, and they can ask questions, but does anyone walk through that door? Do they want to ask? Very few people. Few people do. Few people do. Few people do, right? So this is the tragedy, is what I want you to see. The laws of purity, most of the time, they're lost on people. They're lost on people because there are so many little nuances and things that are cultural. I've been explaining to you this idea of offenses that I think people misunderstand. Broadly, once you start getting it, how it works, then you will see how this principle of seyag l'Torah, the fence around the commandment, or fence around actual teaching, is being practiced in every way possible. So yes, washing your hands before a meal is a fence. It's another thing. So we have so many fences that we do, and they are going to be scattered all throughout the Bible too, because guess what? Those fences are ancient. They've been around. This is not a new thing. This is not something that was invented in the first century. You're going to see this. You're going to see this in Pauline's writing. You're going to see this in all epistles. You'll see it in James and Peter. You can see it in all these kinds of teachings. Every time Jews are going to be teaching somebody, they're going to put up fences of some sort in some way, because it is a way of protecting people from edging into a territory that is not good for you, essentially. And so, yeah, a lot of Judaism is built on these sort of fences. And if you want to understand it, that's kind of where you have to start sometimes. So hopefully that has been a productive and useful study for you. Does that help? Good. All right. So with that, I'll wrap it up. It's Kiddush time. If you want to, sure. It's very simple.